Welcome to my demonstration video for COSC360 web app. So to start with, my game was Snakes and Ladders. So what's going to happen is when you navigate to the page, in my case localhost, for the final submission I'll be using Heroku. When you navigate to the page, a socket is connected to the server, as I can see here. Then when you hit create, a create game event gets sent to the server. So the create game event is shown here, create game requested. So then what it determines is it goes through the code and works out whether or not a game needs to be created that is of that particular size. This is determined by whether or not a game already exists, and if a game does exist, does it have less than 2 players. So once a game's been created, it gets stored in an array, and then a client connects. So the client is different to the initial socket that gets connected when the server first serves the page. So what happens is the client connects, and then they send a get game event. So the get game event retrieves a game for the client, and that event also either creates a game if necessary or retrieves one that is available. In our case, it's retrieved one. So as we can see here, we've got an array of, a board of 10 by 10. We have a chat. We're waiting because we don't have 2 players in the game yet, and both players are on this particular tile. It's a bit hard to see them both because they overlap each other, but when a second client joins, as I'll show you now, it says that the player 2 has joined the game, and it allows the player to roll the dice. So what happens when a game gets created, it generates a unique ID, which is we then use a view router to redirect the client to the game/ID page. So that is done in this section of code here in the index.ts. Down here we have our router and a router method, which just replaces the string game $equals and then adds the URL specified, which gets done in the client, I believe. Here you go, a game state is received. So it replaces the router with the ID of the game state that was retrieved. Okay, the next thing that will happen is the game can commence. So the games and the chats are instanced. So that means that if I send a message to the other player saying, "Hi there," only the other player receives it. If I was to open up another localhost tab and create another game of 10, as we can see, the boards are different. So now if this player was to send a message saying, "I'm client 3, these guys don't receive that message. If I say in this one, "I'm client 2, only player 1 or client 1 receives it, client 3 doesn't. You get the idea. So chats and the games are instanced. Okay, so once the second client has joined the game, player 1 receives an event saying that they can start their roll. So what happens is player 1 rolls the dice. Then at the conclusion of their turn, they swap their turn so that it makes it, so they have a local my turn variable, and this gets flipped, which changes this button's attributes so that it sets it to be disabled and waiting. It also sends a player move event at the conclusion of the player's move. This move gets transmitted to the other players in the game, or other player in the game, which then, once it's received, swaps their my turn event so that they can now roll the dice as well. Okay, so player. So when a player move event is received, the client updates its local version of the game state to reconcile it with the player's new position. This also happens on the server side, so that if, say for example, player 2 disconnects, okay, so on a disconnect, it lets the other player know that the game is paused because there's only one player. If necessary, the player's number will be changed, because if player 1 leaves, then player 2 is now player 1. So that's how that works. But then if I go back here and I request another game state of 10, I should get the same game. So in the same state as it was before. It doesn't work if you search by the URL, unfortunately. I didn't end up getting that working. But both players can now commence and play again. So here we go. You can say, hey, they receive that. Okay, so just to demonstrate, I'll show what that if the board size changes, the square size changes as well. So the squares are always relative to the size of the board that was input. So a board of size 12 will have different square sizes than a board of size 10. Okay, so play commences. They can communicate with each other. They can set their nicknames. So I believe if we go name, then I'll set this player to Sam, and then I'll set this one to Tom. Now, when they send a message, I'll say, hi, I'm Tom. It gets received with the new player's nickname. I can say, hi Tom, I'm Sam. This will also show both players' IDs. So the other thing you can do in chat is view the current points for the user. So points get allocated randomly based on each move. It's a random number generator, basically. So it says here that I have 140 points, whereas Tom should have only 100 points because he hasn't made a move yet. Okay, and so on and so forth. Now, the next thing is the game over event. So when play concludes, okay, now that we're getting close to the end, what happens when you get to the end, if you roll, so obviously which player is this? This must be, okay, so once I get to the end, if I roll a number that is higher than the last position on the board, so if I roll, in this case, if I rolled a 5, I would move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so it would be off the board. So I made it so that you have to roll the exact number you need to finish the game. So if we keep playing until then, we've rolled a 3, so we were able to progress. If we're lucky, we might roll a 1. No, unfortunately not. Keep going until we do. Here we go. So on a game over event, the client sends a game over event to the server, which then deletes the game from the array of games. It also sends the game over event to the other player in the game, which on the game over event, when it gets received, sets this, changes the view component to show these stats rather than the game. So the stats that we show are the progression per roll. So this is the amount of spaces you moved per roll in each game. So this is for just the one particular player. We can see that on their 10th move, this player moved around 46, maybe 47 spaces, which means that they definitely hit a snake, hit a portal, and the same again on move 13. We can see here gets a similar graph for the other player, but they only hit the one portal. We can also see the count of the rolls. So this just shows the count of how many times you roll each number on the dice. So we can see that we rolled a 1 3 times, we rolled a 4. We rolled a 4 2 times, a 2 4 times, a 3 5 times, a 5 5 times, and a 6 3 times as well. And the same for the player 2, obviously. Okay, so that's the majority of the game. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. Unfortunately, I didn't quite get it all done to the point that I was hoping to. I just ran out of time and didn't get it to look pretty, and I didn't get it to function exactly as how I'd hoped, or to implement as many features. I was planning on having things like an item shop perhaps, and it's some way of messing with the other player, but unfortunately I didn't quite get there. So if we just have a bit of a sneak peek at the code here, one of the main things I had to implement was a client and server version of all of my objects. So the server version is where it generates the board. So the Snakes and Ladders client, the Snakes and Ladders server code generates the board based on the size that it is received by the game config. which gets sent by the client. Then it generates the ID and has all of these other variables here, but the server doesn't have to render anything, so a lot of its rendering functions were removed. Okay, so contrasted to the client version of this code, the client version has no generate board function because it doesn't generate a board. It just receives a JSON string, which is then passed, and then it fills the board based on the squares in the server's version of the board. So basically, at some point, I had to rewrite all of my code so that I had a client and server version where all the client versions took in JSON strings. Okay, so the same was for the square clients. It had to take in a string, the portals, the players, pretty much all of the objects. The majority of the view components are in the index.ts. I didn't get around to separating them, unfortunately, so it's a bit of a mess in here. But basically, we've got our game canvas component, which is the SVG that the game renders to. The stat component, which is the div that the stats get appended to in their own SVGs. We've got an interface for the message items, an array of these items, and here's the chat window component. So the chat window shows the input box, the message list, and it uses the v-4 command to make it so that we don't have to manually create a list item for each one. It has a function to return a message, and it has a method for sending a message, which sets the author of the data to the client's ID and the message content to be the contents of the input box. This then calls the send function on the client, which takes in an event string followed by the message content. Okay, so here's the view router that changes the URLs. The root view app, so this is where we have the configuration view, the stats, and the game canvas and chat. As I showed before, here's the replace router function, and here's our role button. The other main code we have is in the client. So the client.ts is where the client's functions get stored, and where the data for the graphs get stored, and basically everything related to the client. So the client creates a game. After it gets created, it calls the create function, which basically just removes elements from the DOM. It connects to the server and requests a game, then calls its receive handlers method because it was just getting cumbersome to list all of the receive handlers in the constructor. Sets the color. I think the player color was something I dabbled with, but I didn't end up implementing, so that's largely irrelevant. Then it sets this client static variable to be this instance of the client. This could have been done with an export, but I just didn't end up getting that done, and it was legacy code that just remained. So the send event is the main bit of the client code. It takes an event string and the data of type any. If the event is a chat message, then it checks to see if it was a command that was entered. If it was a command that was entered, it performs the actions necessary and then sends it on. And the same and any other events get just automatically emitted to the server. If we have a look at the server code, so I've used Express and Socket.io with TypeScript. Basically, the main thing to note in here is that we've got this create game event, which creates a game if it's necessary. If not, it has this function here. No need to create a game. One already exists. And the same with the get game. It's basically a very similar function. The chat message. So what it has to do, it has to get each instance of the game. So if the player if the client that's sending the data is from game one, it needs to know that. So it checks to see which socket the game is connected to. Then it transmits the chat message to each of the clients in that game. And the same with the player moves and the game over event, and then the disconnect event. So the disconnect event, it has to make sure that it removes the game from the array. It also has to send the pause and the new player number event to the players remaining. But yeah, that's basically the gist of it. The technologies I've used is basically just the TypeScript, Vue components, Express, and Socket.io. I didn't end up using any Mongo database, and I didn't end up using any APIs, unfortunately. But that's pretty much my game. If you want to check it out, it'll be on COSC360-swill201.herokuapp.com, where you can then start a game with a player on the server here. And it functions in the exact same way. It's pulled from the GitHub repo, so it has all of the exact same functions. One thing I didn't mention was that when the stats page gets shown at the end, the URL gets updated with the character for a / and then stats. Once again, though, if I reloaded the page, this wouldn't keep the same data. But yeah, that's Snakes and Ladders. That's my app. Thanks for watching. I hope it was okay.